Big shout for Audible for sponsoring this video. The unexpected death of King Alexander III ended the long period of peace and prosperity in Scotland. And with his only heir, his sickly granddaughter Margaret, dying 4 years later, the Scottish throne was left with no clear successor. In an attempt to avoid a civil war between no less than 13 claimants to the throne, Edward Longshanks was asked to arbitrate. Realising that the possibility of controlling Scotland, as he did Wales and Ireland, was within his grasp, the English king ultimately announced in favour of John Balliol, whom he anticipated would be a reliable vassal. However, by 1295, Edward's demands for men and money to support the war with France exasperated the Scottish nobility, who persuaded Balliol to rebel and enter a defence pact with France. Outraged, Edward raised an army and invaded, starting the First War of Scottish Independence. As one of the strongest and ablest of kings to ever rule England, Edward crushed the Scots at Dunbar. John Balliol surrendered his kingdom before being dispatched to the Tower of London. Although a well-garrisoned force was left to guard the conquered lands, disturbances broke out soon after when William Wallace fanned the flames of revolt across Scotland after he defeated an English force at Stirling Bridge. His victory resulted in his elevation to the guardianship of the realm, and preparations began for what was to follow: a confrontation with Edward. Determined to hammer the Scots into submission, the English king marched north, having previously signed a peace treaty with France. He mustered a powerful army and decisively defeated Wallace at Falkirk. With the throne still vacant in 1306, Robert the Bruce made a bid for the crown by killing his main rival, John Comyn III, in the Greyfriars Church, claiming the throne of Scotland as the great-great-grandson of David I. With the support from a section of the Scottish Church and nobility, he was crowned at Scone. But his rebellion got off to a bad start with a shattering defeat at Methven, where most of his loyal followers died or were captured and executed. Then at Dalry, Robert's retreating force was intercepted and nearly wiped out. With his position collapsing, he escaped to the tiny isle of Rathlin, where he set about reorganizing his resources. Worse followed. Robert's sisters, his daughter and his wife Elizabeth, were captured and delivered into the hands of Edward I, and his brother Neil was executed at Berwick. In early 1307, he ventured back toward the mainland with a handful of followers. Meanwhile, his two younger brothers sailed for Galloway, intending to harass English communications between Carlisle and Ayr. But once they landed in Loch Ryan, they were ambushed, captured, and later executed. Robert, on the other hand, had success against the English at Glen Trool, and more significantly at Loudon Hill, which saw his following and his territorial gains grow significantly. Scottish fortunes took a turn for the better when the 68-year-old King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, died on July 7th, 1307. His frivolous son and successor, Edward II, lacked his father's military and political skill, and his reliance on favourites earned him the contempt from his leading magnates, which distracted him from the situation in Scotland. This allowed Robert valuable time to deal with those Scottish nobles who opposed his rule, most notably his arch-rival John Comyn, 3rd Earl of Buchan, whose rich earldom was left at his mercy after he defeated the Earl at Inverurie. Robert took Aberdeen in the summer of 1308, making his hold on the northeast unassailable, and other nobles soon joined him, enabling him to turn his attention to driving the English from his kingdom. Over the coming years, one by one English castles fell, and Robert gave those Scottish nobles, who had not yet come to his banner, a year to swear fealty to him, or they would lose rights to their lands. By early spring of 1314, only the great strongholds of Bothwell and Stirling remained in English hands. Bothwell was isolated and presented no immediate threat, so Robert entrusted his brother Edward Bruce with the siege of Stirling. Philip Mowbray, the beleaguered governor, realized that the fall of Stirling was but a matter of time, and agreed with Edward Bruce that if he was not relieved by June 24th, he would surrender the castle. King Robert was displeased with his brother's chivalrous gesture towards Mowbray, understanding that this deadline would spur the English into action. Now, only a pitched battle would prevent the castle from being relieved, and Robert knew that this could undo all that he had achieved so far. Meanwhile, King Edward II patched up relations with some of his magnates, and was now on his way north to muster an army at Berwick, under pressure to relieve Stirling by June 24th. Money had been raised with a loan from the Pope, and a stream of men converged on Berwick, along with an immense amount of supplies and equipment that were brought by land and sea. As the army marched towards Stirling, all provisions had to be stockpiled and transported, as the Scots would make sure to scorch the land and leave nothing of use for the advancing English. King Robert faced an army more than twice the size of his own, and he positioned his forces a few kilometers south of Stirling, where he waited for Edward. Robert divided his 7,000 infantry into 4 divisions of schiltrons, strong defensive squares of men with pikes, arraying them along the Falkirk Road that goes through the New Park Forest to Stirling. On the morning of June 23rd, Sir James Keith, commander of the 600 light Scottish horsemen, went on patrol to observe the arrival of the English army. Seeing 3,000 horsemen, knights and men-at-arms, their weapons and armour glistening in the sun, was a daunting sight. Behind them, 13,000 infantry and a contingent of Welsh archers exited the Torwood, descending onto the plain south of the Bannockburn stream. The English formation stretched for several kilometres, and Hereford's heavy cavalry in the vanguard started making their way down the steep embankment of the considerable Bannockburn stream, and after climbing up onto the road, they sighted the Scottish footmen, apparently retreating back into the woods. Meanwhile, on the English far right, Baron of Clifford rushed along a path, hidden from view, with his armoured mounted contingent to cut off the Scottish line of retreat towards Stirling Castle. Back on the Bannockburn stream, Hereford's nephew, Sir Henry de Bohun, spotted a figure riding out in front of the Scottish infantry. It was King Robert himself commanding his troops. Henry could not resist. He saw this as a chance to end the war by striking down the Scottish king and achieve personal glory. He lowered his helmet, steered his fully armoured charger towards the king, and pointed his lance straight at him. On his light grey palfrey, unequipped for mounted combat, Robert had every reason to seek safety with his troops. But he set his horse towards the challenger, who bore down full tilt. As they closed in, Bruce quickly swerved his nimble horse aside to avoid the lance, stood up in his stirrups and smashed through Henry's helmet, his axe breaking on impact. The English knight was dead before he hit the ground. Meanwhile, Hereford spurred his men forward along the road, confident that the Scots wouldn't dare confront the armoured horsemen on open ground. He wanted to catch the footmen before they retreated to the safety of the woods. But the Scots weren't retreating. Robert had ordered large pits covered with branches to be dug on both sides of the road, and he waited for the enemy to come to him. Before the English could form up, Robert's schiltrons lowered their spears and moved up in a tightly packed phalanx-like formation. Hereford's cavalry was immediately met with heavy losses as they ran into a wall of Scottish spears. As the rest of his mounted contingent tried to form up, they experienced considerable difficulties with the pit traps. Gloucester circled back with his mounted men, attempting to cross further upstream. Seeing the maneuver, Edward Bruce immediately moved to protect his brother's flank. Unsure about the extent of the pit traps, and with Edward Bruce's troops approaching, the English fell back. Meanwhile, on the Scottish left flank, Randolph noticed Clifford's contingent almost too late. He quickly sprang into action, angry with himself that he almost allowed the enemy to encircle his position. He led his men out of the woods and towards the onrushing English. The Scots formed shoulder to shoulder as an impenetrable wall of spears. Clifford's cavalry circled around their formation, launching attack after attack without success, and, in their frustration at not breaking through the schiltron, the knights hurled spears, darts, and maces, even their swords, at Randolph's men, in a vain attempt to maim enemy troops. Douglas, meanwhile, left the woods with his spearmen and slowly advanced. This lifted the pressure on Randolph as some of the English cavalry wheeled about to meet the incoming enemy. Randolph seized the opportunity and assumed the offensive, charging right through the English ranks. With their formation broken and with fresh Scottish infantrymen approaching, the English heavy cavalry dispersed. This brought the fighting of June the 23rd to an end. Although the English losses weren't heavy and they still retained their 2-to-1 numerical superiority, their morale took a big hit after the two clashes. With the day drawing to a close, King Edward's troops needed a place to encamp and the horses needed to be watered. He decided to move all of the cavalry and about a half of the infantry into a marshy area across the Bannockburn, while the remaining infantry and the baggage train would encamp south of the stream. Meanwhile, Robert Bruce gathered his officers for a council of war. Despite the successes of the day, harsh past experiences taught him to avoid pitched battles against heavy cavalry, and he considered withdrawing deeper into the rugged Scottish wilderness, where it would be too hard for the English to follow. But as the talks went on, a Scottish knight in English service defected and swore fealty to Robert Bruce. He informed the king that the English are demoralized and disorganized, pledging his life that if Bruce attacked in the morning, he would have victory. Robert turned to his officers saying, "Shall we fight or not?" In one voice they boldly answered for battle. On the morning of June 24th, among the English a mood of caution replaced the earlier presumption of easy victory. King Edward began deploying his cavalry between the deep ravine of the Pell Stream and the thick wooded area in the south, ordering archers and infantry to form behind them. King Robert the Bruce then gave the momentous order to advance across the open field against the mighty English army, more than twice the strength than his own, and with far superior weapons. The seemingly suicidal plan of advancing with infantry against heavy cavalry was only possible because of the innovative way in which Robert trained his schiltrons to move forward in echelon formation. He hoped that the English would still view his formations as defensive and wouldn't appreciate just how vital their mobility was for his plan of attack. As the Scots moved slowly to keep their cohesion, Robert sent his archers forward to divert as much attention from his spearmen as possible. And the ruse worked, as English bowmen responded by shooting at Scottish archers instead of the infantry formations. As the English were still forming their lines, their commanders argued over who should lead the cavalry attack. Refusing to wrangle for too long, Gloucester charged headlong across the open space between the two armies, followed by Clifford and many other prominent knights. As they crashed into Edward Bruce's Skiltron, Gloucester and his comrades were instantly killed by the wall of spears raised to meet them. Most of the cavalry contingent was annihilated in a matter of minutes. The Scottish bristling hedge of steel-tipped pikes now pushed forward. A succession of spirited attacks were mounted by the English, but they weren't able to break the Scottish formation. Observers said that as the cavalry met the Skiltrons, the horses disappeared from sight like men plunging in the sea. Slowly but surely, Edward Bruce's formation reached Bannockburn and anchored its position to the stream, allowing other Skiltrons to push forward. Robert now planned to trap the English between the two streams. For hours the fighting continued as the Scottish spearmen held their ground against bruising rushes of horsemen. Physical demands on individual spearmen must have been enormous. The disciplined Scots showed great unity against the attacks of the English cavalry as they edged their way further into the narrowing pocket between the Bannockburn and Pell Stream. So far, the English archers, who could have potentially broken up the Scottish formations, weren't utilised properly, but someone finally ordered them to shoot at the Skiltrons. However, with Scottish ranks being so narrow, the arrows now flew harmlessly over them. The bowmen were then ordered to shoot past the cavalry, directly at the spearmen. This also failed, as English horsemen towered over the Scottish footmen, in effect shielding them from arrow volleys and finding themselves in the line of fire. Nevertheless, arrow volleys continued as English archers gradually moved across the Pell Stream to get a better angle. Seeing this, Robert ordered his light cavalry under Mareschal Keith to try and disperse them, recognizing the danger archers could pose for his spearmen. Meanwhile, the Scots closed the pocket between Pell Stream and Bannockburn, effectively trapping the English between the deep ravines of the two streams. After crossing the Pell Stream himself, Keith's light cavalry galloped with their lances levelled towards the English archers. The bowmen were overrun, and those who weren't killed fled across the stream. Keith continued to patrol up and down the Pell Stream to prevent any further flanking attempts by archers. As the hard-fought battle reached its savage attrition stage, the push of the exhausted Scots slowed, and Robert now played his full hand by sending his own two Skiltrons forward, aware that he could not afford a stalemate. Some filled the gaps in Douglas's spear lines, while others leaned with all their strength against the backs and shoulders of men whose knees were buckling after hours of fighting. The English finally began giving more ground. With the outcome now virtually certain to go against them, English leaders were determined to get their king to safety, as the Scottish spearmen were close about him on the front line. The withdrawal of 500 knights to protect the king not only guaranteed defeat, but triggered an undisciplined flight by many others. The defeat of the English opened up the north of England to Scottish raids and allowed the Scottish invasion of Ireland. In exchange for the captured nobles, Edward II released Robert's wife Elizabeth and his sisters Christina and Mary, as well as his daughter Marjorie, ending their 8-year imprisonment in England. The victory at Bannockburn secured Scotland's independence with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. The English crown recognised the full independence of the Kingdom of Scotland and acknowledged Robert the Bruce, his heirs and successors, as the rightful rulers. This video is sponsored by Audible. Audible is the largest online source of audio entertainment and information, supported on all major platforms. Their library contains an unmatched selection of audiobooks, and for the fans of the history genre that follow our channel, we highly recommend The History of the Medieval World by Susan Wise Bauer. From the conversion of Constantine to the First Crusade, this audiobook tells the fascinating, often violent story of kings, generals, and the peoples they ruled. And you can check it out for free. Hit the link in the description and head over to audible.com/HistoryMarche. Or if you're in the US, text HistoryMarche to 500 500. By visiting Audible, you will help support our channel and you'll get access to 1 free audiobook of your choice and 2 originals from Audible's exclusive collection. A few that caught our eye are History of Scotland, a captivating guide to Scottish history, the Wars of Scottish Independence and William Wallace, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, and The City of God, one of the most important works of Christian history and philosophy, narrated by one of the voices of HistoryMarche, yours truly, David McCallion. Best yet, you can cancel your subscription at any time and you get to keep your audiobooks. Go to www.audible.com/HistoryMarche or text HistoryMarche to 500 500 and start listening with an exclusive 30-day free trial, 1 free audiobook of your choice, and 2 Audible originals absolutely free. Credit goes to our awesome patrons who make videos like this one possible. Consider joining them to support our work. You can also support us by subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell button to get notified when our new videos are released. And as always, thank you for watching.